Hi, welcome to our first video together. So this is psychology. This is the beginning of the journey. So we are going to start off with just a simple introduction to psychology, and we're going to look at some of the history behind it and some of the people that were really important in creating psychology and making it what it is today. So make sure as you're watching this video that you also have access to your digital notebook and you are taking notes from this video on the note page that says Intro to Psychology, right? Because we talked about how our notes are going to be a formative grade, and so we want to make sure that we're taking notes as we're watching the video. So I told you on the first day that the first couple units might be a little boring, but that's okay because we have to learn. We have to set that foundation before we start talking about the more interesting things. We have to understand the people that are involved, the different perspectives, and stuff like that. So let's get started. So here are the learning targets. These come directly from College Board. These are what we need to go back and look at when we're studying to make sure that we really understand each learning target and we could say, yes, I've learned that, I know that, so you can be prepared for that AP test. Okay, so let's start off with the philosophy of psychology. So before it was even a science, it was considered a philosophy. So just an idea that a couple really smart guys were exploring. So they really just started exploring the mind and the body and how they're connected, how they're related. And we came up with two conclusions, very different from each other. So you had the Hebrews, Aristotle, and Augustine. They thought the mind and the body were connected, so they worked together. Socrates, Plato, and Descartes, French, they thought that they were distant, right? So they could work independently. So we've got two different sides of an idea and different people on each side. And then they started looking at how are ideas formed. So the ideas that we have every day that lead to certain behaviors and certain actions, how are those formed? So Socrates and Plato thought that you were born with some of those ideas, right? So you came out the womb and you had some ideas, some characteristics that you were just born with. But you had Aristotle and John Locke who said, wait, hold on. I think the mind is a blank slate and then you learn everything, right? You're very impressionable. And so some of those ideas that are formed come from like your environment and the things that you're around and the things that you're learning. Okay. So we're going to look at a couple really big names, some really important people when it comes to psychology. So the first girl you've probably learned about if you've already taken U.S. history, but Dorothea Dix, she was very, very important when it comes to psychology. So people have been dealing with mental health for a long time. We just didn't know what they were dealing with. We didn't understand the mind and the body until everything started in the mid-1800s. But people still experienced some of this disorders that people have today, right? And so it was like, what do we do with them? So if anyone was acting abnormal or they were suffering in a way that didn't make sense physically, they were deemed crazy and they were put in mental institutions or mental asylums, right? So these were really not good places to be. They were really scary. They thought if you had some sort of mental illness, then you were either possessed or there was a bad spirit in you. And so they would try to get that out of you in whatever way. So beatings, being locked up, and people really didn't see other people with mental issues as human. It was kind of like, oh, something's wrong with you. You're not okay, right? And Dorothea Dix just wasn't okay with that. She really wanted to reform those mental institutions, and that's basically what she did. She really started advocating for those who were not able to advocate for themselves, and she created the first mental asylum during the American Civil War. Now, there were already places for them to go, but this was one where she wanted them to be taken care of and protected and all of that stuff. So this guy looks really important, and he is. So this is Wilhelm Wundt. He's German, so those W's sound like V's. And he is what we call the father of psychology because he created the first psychological lab where this was studied in Germany. And a lot of stuff really started to take place once he got started with this research. And his whole idea behind psychology, like I said, the term is structuralism, but his focus was the conscious mind or your consciousness, which is something that people really didn't talk about, didn't really know a lot about. And he really wanted to see how that worked. Are we aware when we are making decisions, when we are deciding what to do? And his big thing was he would use what's called introspection. So it's really focusing on your conscious mind, what you're aware of, your looking inward, your decisions, your thinking, all of that fun stuff. So William James is going to be around the same time as Wundt, but like we said, he's German. William James is American, right? So he's credited for being the first American psychologist. He's going to set up the first lab here, and he's also going to be later a professor. And so he's really bringing it to America, getting us involved in this whole new study of psychology. Except he's going to criticize Wundt. He's going to say, no, your ideas are too narrow, too boring, which is not a very good criticism. We want to be more specific than that. But he was influenced a lot by Darwin. So hopefully we know that Charles Darwin is a really big player in evolution. And James really just wanted to see how we function in our environment, right? How do we understand our consciousness, and how does that help you adapt to your environment? So how do you function, aka functionalism, right? He's going to use introspection as well, but unlike Wundt, who just had us look inward, just taking yourself and you looking inward, James is also going to use different surveys, questionnaires, and mental tests to help gauge where you're actually at, because sometimes we can be self-biased and we cannot understand what we're feeling or thinking. And so he's going to bring in that whole idea of questions and questionnaires to kind of see a better picture of how we function in society. Okay, let's look at Gestalt. Now, this is a type of psychology that we are going to come back to. We are going to study it more in our sensation and perception unit, but we're going to introduce it here. And the big idea here is that we observe consciousness as a whole experience. So this perspective really wants to take the different parts of our life and our consciousness and our mind and put it together and see the whole picture, so we can do better understanding that way. So your key word here is whole, because that's what we're going to be looking at. But this is very different than Wundt and his idea. You've probably heard of Sigmund Freud. He gets characterized as the guy that had some crazy ideas, and everything stems from your unconsciousness and your childhood trauma. And his perspective that he kind of came up with is called psychoanalysis. And he really wanted to focus on the abnormal behavior and figure out where that came from. And his conclusion was that all of your behavior and your mental processes come from unconscious forces. So everything that you think or you do is coming from that unconscious that we're not aware of. So you heard Wundt and James focus on the conscious mind. Freud is going to focus on the unconscious mind. And he's going to do that by using this really cool thing called free association. And that's really just saying whatever you want when they tell you something. So, for example, if I said, say the first thing that comes to your mind when I say the color yellow. Okay, for me, when I said yellow, the first thing that popped into my mind was sunshine. So if I was in an exercise and we were doing free association and someone said yellow, then I would say sunshine because that's the first thing I thought of. He would also analyze your dreams and try to figure out, okay, this is the actual dream that you had, but here's the unconscious message behind that dream. So his ideas are very controversial. There's still a perspective of psychology that goes off this, but a lot of his stuff has been disproven. Now, you might be thinking, then why the heck are we studying him? Well, he's the first guy to really focus on the unconscious mind, right? He's the one that got other people thinking, oh, wait, like there might be something else to our behavior and our mental processes besides just our conscious mind. And he explored kind of childhood and those different stages and traumas that can happen in childhood. And he believed all of those were suppressed down into your unconscious. And that's why you had abnormal behaviors. So we'll talk about Freud a lot. He shows up multiple times in multiple units. We've got B.F. Skinner and we've got J.B. Watson. They are going to give you a completely different perspective. This whole idea of behaviorism became really popular starting in the 1920s, but it got really big as time went on, the 50s and 60s, especially with B.F. Skinner, who I'm pretty sure is still alive. Or he just died recently. Either way, they basically disagreed with what everyone else had to say. They were not a fan of introspection, not into it. They think that everything you do, everything you think, all of your actions are learned. Everything is learned. Nothing is innate, right? You're not born with anything. You are learning it. And so with that, they think that behavior in psychology should only be studied with what you can observe. So if I'm observing someone's behavior, then that's the only way that we can figure out what's going on, right? So it's all about observing behaviors. And they think it's all external factors that are affecting your behavior and your mental processes. Skinner specifically didn't think the unconscious or the hidden parts of the mind really had anything to do with your behaviors. It's all learned, and we're going to study it based on what we observed from you. Okay, so if you notice at the beginning of your digital notebook, I have the definition of psychology today. So it has changed so much over the years, starting in the late 1800s up until now. There's different things that have been added and taken away to the definition. But you just really need to know what we define psychology as today, and that is the scientific study of behavior and mental processes. So those two things go together. So you've seen throughout history, people have tried to explain either one or the other or say that they don't go together, but contemporary psychology is going to say that these two things come together. What we do, aka the study of behavior, and our inner thoughts and feelings, our mental processes. But here's the controversy today. Are our traits and behaviors based on biology, aka nature, or one's environment and experiences, aka nurture? So we have this constant controversy of, are we born a certain way? Are we wired a certain way and that's why we behave that way or think that way? Or is it because of the people that we've surrounded ourselves with, the environment that we've grown up in? Which one is it? Or is it a combination of both, right? You're going to see a bunch of different perspectives try to answer this question and explain it a certain way, right? And there's a biopsychosocial approach. And if you take those different parts of the word, right? Bio is going to be that biology, that nature influence. This is going to be our genes, right? We're going to look at our predispositions, what's passed down to us. But also, we can't just look at that. We have to look at our psychological influences as well. I'm trying to move there we go. So this is like your learned fears or expectations or emotional responses or how you think about things, your cognitive processes. We've got to look at that as well as looking at a social and cultural influence, right? So this is exactly what it sounds like. The presence of other people involved in your life. So the people you surround yourself with, your friends, your family, this can also leak into your culture as well. Like, what does your culture say about you? What are some ways that your culture has defined who you are? So the biopsychosocial approach is going to look at all of those things. Okay, so if you have kind of checked out on me because you're over listening about some really old people and some really old ideas, I'm going to need you to check back in because we're going to look at the perspectives, and these perspectives are going to be present in every unit that we talk about until the exam. So the first one, the first perspective is biological, right? We're going to look at neuroscience. So this is exactly what it sounds like. We're going to understand how the brain and the body create thoughts, emotions, and memories. Now, with this, we're looking at how they physically create those, right? So we're going to look at actual like different parts of the brain. We're going to look at the brain chemistry, right? And the different parts, like how these things are created physically. And we're going to talk a lot about this in Unit 2, when we study the brain. So some questions that we like to look at when we're studying this perspective, how are messages transmitted throughout the body? So how do we get a message from the brain down to our feet? Like, how do we do that? How is blood chemistry linked with motives? So we're going to have different like neurotransmitters and different hormone levels and different blood chemistry. And how does that affect you? Like, how does your physical body and brain create thoughts and emotions and all of that fun stuff? So very anatomy based, very physical based. So our next perspective that we're going to look at is evolutionary. We're going to look at this more in the unit when we talk about motivation and emotion, but basically it focuses on how natural selection, how that process has caused our behaviors to develop and adapt. So a good keyword there is adapt. And basically, we're going to look at that using behavior. So how does evolution influence our behavior tendencies? Like I said, we'll talk about that more in a later unit. Now, behavior genetics. So we're going to take our genes and our environment. So that sounds a little nature nurture to you, I bet. And we're going to see how those influence an individual, right? We're going to see to what extent does your genes impact your personality versus if your environment impacts your personality or intelligence or mental disorders, right? So this is one that you're going to see in a lot of units because we have a unit on personality, we have a unit on intelligence, and we have a unit on mental disorders. Plus, nature versus nurture is that constant question that we're always asking. So this perspective is very important to learn now so we can recognize it and apply it in future situations. Okay, so we have some more perspectives. Let's look at psychodynamic first. So I told you about psychoanalysis. This one is linked to that. This is just like the new name for psychoanalysis, but it's still going to focus on the same thing, right? It's going to focus on the unconscious mind and how that drives our behavior. So unconscious is your key word there when we're talking about psychoanalysis and psychodynamic. It's all about the unconscious, right? So we are going to see or study where that energy in the unconscious, where that comes from and how that motivates our actions. So Freud talks a little bit about childhood trauma and repressing things, which we'll get into a little bit more in a later unit. But like I said, it's all about the unconscious and how that drives our behavior. And a lot of time we're going to be looking at the abnormal behavior there. The next perspective is behavioral. So this comes straight from behaviorism, right? And we're looking at how our behavior is shaped by what we learn. Learning. That's your key word for behavioralism. For this behavior perspective, it's all about learning, right? And that's a bunch of stuff. Like, how do you automatically know to get up from class when the bell rings? Or how did we learn to fear certain things? Like maybe you're scared of rats. How did you get there? And how can we change those? What if I don't want to be scared of rats anymore? Like, how can we change those problematic behaviors? That's all going to fall under this behavior perspective. We also have the cognitive perspective. When you think about cognitive, think about thinking. Your keyword is thinking. Cognitive is all about thinking. Thinking. One more time. Thinking, right? It's how you think, right? So how do we take in information? How do we store it? How do we retrieve it later to use it? How does this affect our actions and our perceptions? So we're going to talk a lot about this in the cognition unit. Okay, we've got two more perspectives. We have the humanistic perspective. So when you think humanistic, you kind of want to think hippie. They are going to focus on human growth. It's going to always be positive. So that article we read about positive psychology, that's going to fit under humanistic, right? And they're all about your potential and how do we use that to get to self-actualization. And we're going to focus on our self-concept, how we see each other. So we're going to see a lot of unconditional positive regard here. And the whole idea is, how do I make myself a better person? What steps can I take, or what things can I do to become that better person, to hit that self-actualization level? If you've heard of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, that's going to fall under this perspective. And last but not least, we have our social cultural. It's exactly what it sounds like. It's what we talked about on a couple slides before. But basically, how are we going to interpret human behavior based on your social and cultural context? So we're going to look at different ethnic groups. We're going to look at different economic levels, male versus female, right? And we're going to see how all of those things influence your behavior. So, like I said, that one's exactly what it sounds like. You've got your keywords in the name, right? Your social environment, the people you're around, and your culture, your cultural environment. Okay, so let's get into the domains a little bit. So a big part of psychology is research, and you're going to have two different groups. You're going to have basic research and applied research. So I'm going to show you the domains or the groups that fall under basic research, and this is like experiments. These are going to be pretty similar to the perspectives that you just saw. So a biological psychologist, when they're doing research, they're going to analyze the connection between the mind and the body. When we're looking at development, we're going to study how behavior and mental processes change over a lifespan. So how was your behavior and your mental processes at 2 versus at 8 versus at 12 versus at 16 versus at 18, right? We're going to study that over a lifespan because I promise you don't behave and think the same way you did when you were 2. Hopefully not. Cognitive, like I said, this is all about thinking and using the mind that way. So we're going to study how we perceive, how we think, and how we solve problems. We're going to do experiments with that. Personality is we're just going to investigate our persistent traits. So the traits that stay with you throughout your life, we're going to investigate those. Social, we're just going to explore or research how people can influence one another. And then psychometric, this one's a little funky, but we are going to be concerned with the theory and technique of psychological measurement. So this is basically just the idea that we are testing things. We are seeing if what it's supposed to measure, it actually measures. This one is a little funky. Now let's look at applied research. So this is a different category. So you're going to have some different domains here. You're going to have your industrial organization. So these are psychologists that are going to come into the workplace and they're going to study the behavior and just see how people in a work corporate environment are interacting with each other. And see how we can improve like production and people being motivated and productive and all that stuff. Educational psychology, these psychologists would come in and kind of explore school, right? The classroom, like teaching and learning. So how do we solve some of those issues inside the school? And then we have counseling. So this is someone who might help someone cope with something. So this can be academic, like your school counselor, or this can be vocational, or maybe even focus on marital challenges. Like you can go see a marriage counselor. This is someone like helping you through something. Clinical psychology, it's going to be a little bit different. This is going to focus on how to assess and treat people with psychological disorders. And that's going to be their main focus, right? In counseling, that's usually not the main focus. You're working through something with someone. Clinical, we're going to be specifically working with people who have diagnosed mental disorders. And then positive psychology, you probably recognize that from the article if you read it. But this is just how to focus on adding positive events and influences in life. So basically how wearing a smile, even if it's fake, can actually make you feel better and turn into a real smile later, right? This kind of goes with the whole like fake it until you make it mindset. Okay, so we've got some differences between clinical psychology and then psychiatry. Now, the big difference is that a psychologist has a PhD and a psychiatrist is a medical professional. So a psychiatrist can actually use treatments like drugs or psychotherapy to treat patients. So these are the ones that can actually prescribe you medication, as a clinical psychologist cannot. Big difference here is who can give you drugs and who cannot, right? Psychiatrists can give you drugs, a psychologist cannot. Okay, last but not least, we've just got one more thing. There are different organizations that psychologists can be a part of, scientific and professional. And one of the really, really big ones is the American Psychological Association, the APA. It's still around today. You can become a part of it. But basically, it was founded in 1892, so a long time ago. And you've got some important names you want to know that are associated with the APA. So you have Mary Wilton Calkins. She was the first female president of the APA. She's got kind of a crazy story if you want to do a little bit more research on her. G. Stanley Hall, he was the first president of the APA. And then he was the first to earn a PhD in psychology. So he was the first guy to get that big degree. And then Washburn, she was the first female to earn her PhD in psychology. So she came after Calkins. Calkins kind of like paved the way for her, I guess. And so Washburn was the first one to actually get her PhD in psychology. So they started letting women get educated. So that's great. So the big thing from this video that you want to make sure that you understand, you want to understand those perspectives. You can also look at the domains as well, that basic research versus applied research, and then just make sure that you know those important names that we talked about at the beginning of the video. They are going to be really important. You can't understand psychology if you don't understand where it first came from. So you want to know the people involved, and you also want to know the current definition that psychology is the study of behavior and mental processes. So make sure you have your notes filled out in your digital notebook. We'll be talking about those in class the next time I see you, and I hope that you enjoyed this video.